Hi everyone! It is a beautiful fall day outside. The bamboo outside my window is looking incredibly anachronistic and out of place, and very, very green. But the air is beautiful, it's crisp, there's a slight breeze, and the sun is just like so gently warm. But it is Florida, so everything's still very, very green. I feel like I should be looking at, a myriad of different colors of oranges and reds, but it's still very, very green outside, and it will be until wintertime, in which that green will not even have a transition period, but will just be completely black and brown with death. So yeah, fun being in Florida. But I wanted to make this video about this book that I read. And for a lot of you, it's going to seem a little bit out of place, a little bit of a tangent from what I usually talk about, which is spiritual things. But for me, this is kind of spiritual. I initially started to read this book because I thought it really connected with my spiritual path in a very powerful way, or thought that it would. And to an extent it has. It's given me a lot to think about. I think it's definitely a different perspective on a subject that I don't necessarily know everything about, but that I thought I was gaining a kind of basic idea of it, at least. The subject here being love. I don't know about you guys, but love takes a very important place, takes a very important place in my practice. And I wasn't expecting it to. It happened when I started to pray to Aphrodite, and I started to get to know her more. And as I started to understand her more by reading things, by reading scholarly things about her, in which people talked about her role within ancient Greece, but also her role within the pantheon of Greek deities and her role within the universe. Her importance just grew, especially the importance of love. I think she, of all the gods, and you guys can totally disagree with me on this, I'm sure that you guys have your own opinions about this, but I definitely think that Aphrodite, of all the gods, is the most tangible, if that makes sense. I think her energy is the energy that we can feel most easily. She isn't necessarily separate from us, but a part of us. She grows from within us in the form of love. And this love we can experience with anything or for anything outside of just that human relationship of boyfriend and boyfriend, girlfriend and girlfriend, boyfriend and girlfriend. She can be experienced when looking at a beautiful picture, when being outside, with smelling something beautiful, with all these different things of listening to a beautiful voice, of reading a beautiful book, of so much. She really just encapsulates so much of what it means to be alive, or the beauty of being alive. And so in that way, she just plays a really important role, not just in my practice, but within my every single day. There's so many times where I can look at something and just be touched with that little hint of Aphrodite. I can just feel her in here, really, really powerfully and palpably. And that's really just like the tip of the iceberg in regards to how I feel about her in relation to my life, other people's lives, my spiritual practice. And it continues to grow every single day, my idea, my concept of love and of Aphrodite. And so I'm constantly trying to read about different things that's going to open up my mind about her place in my life. And one of these books that I've read, that I've been kind of skirting around trying to talk about here, is the Symposium by Plato. So before I get into the concepts that have been exposed and entertained in this book, I want to kind of give you an idea of what it's about. So first things first, the symposium. What is a symposium? A symposium is kind of like a dinner party, but it's different in that the ancient Greeks didn't invite everyone, but specifically older, well, not necessarily older men, but men who were part of the higher echelons of Greek society. So philosophers, artists, politicians, businessmen, things like that. And in this party, they would sit around in a big room that was essentially just a square with seats on the side so people could talk to each other. And they would eat a lot of food and drink a lot of alcohol and get a little bit tipsy and crank. And while they were like off their rockers with drunkenness, they would actually have really deep philosophical discussions about things, or political discussions, or whatever. They would talk about basically anything, but it would be things that were worthy of being talked about in that kind of environment. And like I said, it was just these men who were parts of the higher parts of society. They excluded women. Slaves were there, but obviously as slaves. It was basically just kind of like a stroke of the ego for all of these different men, whose egos probably didn't really need to be stroked that much. So in this book, there's a few different characters. The most important character probably, or one of the most important characters, I think there's one more that's slightly more important than him. But in this book, Sophocles actually plays a very huge role. And it's a fictionalized telling of a situation. So Sophocles obviously is a real person, but in this book he's been fictionalized to an extent, and says things that we don't necessarily know that he has actually said before. But using him in this turns it into obviously historical fiction, but it also elevates the concepts being explored within the story to a point of a philosophy, to a point that is more connected with legend almost, which makes it seem more important, as if the things in here that are being said are extremely important, that we should be listening to them, because Sophocles is saying them, and of course you all know that he is this big-time ancient Greek philosopher. So, at the beginning of the symposium, I don't know how they come up with this idea, but they essentially decide to go around the room to the different people who have been invited, and have each of these people make a eulogy about the Greek god of love. And the first person who goes, I think it's Phaedrus. He's kind of a nondescript character, but he begins to talk about love and mostly about what love does for people, what love makes people do. And he describes love as being the oldest god, and this is it's an idea that has been held by a lot of people, but it's also an idea that has been disagreed with by a lot of other people, because there's two different schools of thought. One is that love is a very old god, born from Chaos, who was the original goddess of the ancient Greek mythology. And the other that he is actually a really young god, born from Aphrodite. And there's actually a similar argument about Aphrodite as well, which comes into play in the discussion here too. And I'll get into that. So Phaedrus talks about how love is a whole god, and he talks about all the different things that love makes us do. It makes us kind of like beggars. He talks about the difference between the loved and the loved one, and that lover relationship. And it's interesting how they change it, because I think that the ancient Greeks, who were very free, I think, in comparison to our society about sexuality, they understood that men sometimes get together with men, and even to an extent that women sometimes get together with women, although that was less accepted back then. But the relationship between these men was different from how we perceive these relationships today, and that it was usually consistent of an older man and a young man, or even a boy. It gets really pedophilic at times, which is so gross. There's parts of the book where they talk about like the best time to be with a young boy is when he starts to grow his beard. So first of all, when you just start to grow your beard, you're not old enough to be in a relationship with a 30-year-old man. You're just not. But it also implies that men were getting together with boys who were too young to grow their beard, which is even grosser. Or just as gross, actually. So I get that it was a separate time, but I am so not jiving with that idea of older men being with young boys. like, no matter how that relationship was perceived back then as being a teacher-student relationship, it is just gross. So, what was I talking about before I got off on that tangent? So, this relationship between these men back then were different in that part, or in that aspect, but also different in that, like I said, they separated the two with the lover and with the loved. The lover was generally the older man. He was he had a more stable place in society as either a politician or an artist, someone who had something that he could teach to someone who's younger, which would be the loved one, which is generally, like I said, a young man, either beardless or just growing his beard. And this young man was usually really, really beautiful, didn't know a lot about the world, obviously, because he was young, naive. And what is implied within this book is that the loved one, or that the lover is the one who actually loves something or someone, which is the loved one. And that the loved one, I don't think, either feels it as strongly for the lover or doesn't feel it at all. Maybe they're not old enough to feel it. But there is that difference of the active participant and the passive participant, of the subject and the object, which comes into play with other things. It's not quite as explicit throughout the rest of the book, but they definitely talk about this concept of the subject and the object. And the object can be any number of things, from an actual person to a painting, to a work of art, to a story, to flowers, to whatever is beautiful. And I'll get into that in the future. So they're having this wonderful party, and everyone's a little bit buzzed. And they start to talk about, they still continue to talk about love. Someone else comes to the stand. He talks about how there's two different aspects of love, two different aspects of Aphrodite. One aspect is the heavenly aspect, and one aspect is the common aspect. The heavenly aspect is usually recognized as Urania, and the common aspect is usually recognized as Pandemos. I'm going to talk about them as the heavenly aspect and the common aspect, just because that's a little bit easier to remember. But essentially, I think, did I already mention that they believe that love, or that, I just forgot what his name was, but the guy who was speaking before that I was talking about, sorry if I jump around a little bit, but the guy who was speaking before about love, originally, he talked about how love was actually one of the older gods. I think I did that already. So anyway, this belief that love was either one of the oldest gods or one of the youngest gods also comes into play into what ancient Greeks believed Aphrodite was, or how old ancient Greeks Aphrodite was. A lot of people believe that she was one of the older gods, while other people believe that she was one of the younger gods. The older Aphrodite, they believe, came from Uranus, and solely from Uranus, solely from a man. And so because of that, this is the heavenly aspect of Aphrodite, the older version, who came specifically from Uranus and only Uranus. Because they believe that she, while representing as a female, actually had mostly male qualities about her. And the other Aphrodite, the younger, was the Pandemos Aphrodite, the common Aphrodite. And she came from Dione and Zeus, I believe. And obviously, later in time, so yeah, she's younger. And they believe that the common Aphrodite represented all common forms of love. And they recognize the common forms of love as being those types of loves, those types of love such as a man and a woman, sometimes a man and a boy. But if it's within a man and a boy, it's specifically a relationship between a man and a boy that is specifically physical, specifically about looks rather than, intelligence or emotions or anything like that. Something that is purely superficial. And I'll get into why they considered men and women to be part of the common aspect of love. But let me talk a little bit about the heavenly aspect. The heavenly aspect also represents the relationship between men and boys, or men and men. but it's different in that this aspect of love centers around the belief that the highest form of love is love that consists mostly of a mental dialogue, of an emotional dialogue between two different people. They brought up a lot of different myths that I'm sure we've all heard, such as Achilles and Patroclus. Is that what his name is? I think Patroclus. Achilles and Patroclus. Achilles died to avenge Patroclus's death. And a few other ones where they either died for their love or risked their lives for their love. And how there was something deeper than just like the physical. There was something deeper than that. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well. It's kind of a complex concept. But essentially, if you were someone who was in a relationship, specifically if you were a man in a relationship with another man, if it went beyond the physical, if it went beyond sex, into the mental, into an almost esoteric kind of transcending kind of spiritual love, then that was the higher form of love. That was the important type of love. And the reason why they separated these two types of love is because one love led to what they believed would be a form of immortality, whereas the other love would lead to usually either no form of immortality or a more crude version of immortality. And what I mean by that is, and then this is where the men and women come into play, and into why they are part of the common form of love, that relationship of man and woman. And that's because they believe that women were not as intelligent, not as emotionally as intelligent as men were, in general, not as physical, not as powerful as men, and so basically a lesser form of man. And they didn't believe that a man or a woman could create a tangible aspect of their love, if that makes sense, beyond the reproductive force, which is, giving birth to a child. But they didn't believe that giving birth to a child was the highest form of this relative immortality, because essentially reproducing ourselves is the only way that we can achieve a level of immortality as human beings, as mortals, other than, creating works of art or making a name in history, which is a little bit more permanent. And it's more permanent because, we can have as many children as we want, but unless we as individuals do something that is going to put our names into the history books, that is going to make people remember us by creating beautiful works of art, by writing beautiful works of poetry, by acting out amazing feats in war or in politics, our names are going to be lost to history no matter how many children we have, because only the children then can actually make a name for themselves, if that makes sense. And so that's why they're separated. They didn't. If you're only with someone specifically because they're beautiful and because you want to have sex with them, or if you're with a woman who they didn't believe to have the same faculties as men, then the level of immortality that you can achieve has been limited. Because if you're with someone if you're just with someone because they're beautiful, there's not a lot that can come from that. It doesn't have a lot of substance. It doesn't have a lot of tangibility. Beauty fades ultimately. And if you're with a woman, then you can only really expect to have children with her. She's not really going to help you create anything that is going to last and be memorialized. Of course, it's completely wrong, but I'll get into that a little bit later. And the heavenly version of love, of Aphrodite, represents, like I said, male relationships, specifically male relationships that tap into the spiritual, into the mental, into being transcendent. And they're transcendent because these are the types of relationships where the dialogue that is within them helps one or the other, or both people within that relationship, to create something or do something that is going to be lasting, that is going to immortalize them within human history. This is what they believed. And this idea of becoming as immortal as possible, and it's impossible for a human being to become as immortal as the gods, but immortality was something that I think a lot of Greek philosophers had a lot of internal conflict about. I think that they all wanted to, on some level, be immortal. And they believed that the only way to do that would be to write beautiful things, create beautiful things, act out amazing feats in war, things like that. I guess they just didn't see. I mean, I think it's something that a lot of people still today fight over with themselves about, why are we here if we're just going to die and if that's it. So in a lot of ways, by implying that their love, and it would be only their love because the people who are talking in this book are men who are in relationships with men, by saying that their love was the important love, was the immortal love, it made them feel better about their love, as if there was a meaning behind it, when really there's not a whole lot of meaning behind the love that we have for other people, especially romantic relationships outside of reproduction. And if you're in a relationship with a man and you're also a man, or if you're in a relationship with a woman, you're also a woman, obviously you can't reproduce yet. Science is doing its thing right now, but for the most part, you can't reproduce. And so you have to sort of look at other ways of making your love valid. And it isn't really necessary, I don't think. I don't think it's necessary for us to do this with a lot of things, even outside love. I think people, and obviously the Greek philosophers did, I think people worry themselves too much about the importance of things, rather than just living through them. But that's slightly a tangent. Anyway, so I'm sorry if this is so confusing. I'm sorry, but I talked a little bit about the different aspects of love, the two different aspects of love. And this idea didn't really jive with me. I kind of like the idea of two different aspects of love, of there being like a heavenly version and a common version, because I can kind of perceive that as happening. But the way that they perceive that as happening is not something that I jive with. I don't think that women would, just because they're women, be considered part of the common love. Women are just as intelligent, just as emotionally intelligent, just as creative, just as powerful as men are. And they are just as capable of achieving that kind of heavenly love that the Greek philosophers spoke about in this story. A perfect example of this would be Sappho. If you read her poems, specifically her poems devoted to Aphrodite or about Aphrodite, there is such a tangible aspect of those poems, to where you can almost feel what she's feeling towards another woman. I wonder if that would actually play into their idea of heavenly love because it's same-sex. But she does it for men as well. And her poems are just gorgeous. And the relationship that she has with Aphrodite is probably, I think, the most realistic relationship I've ever seen depicted within a work of art between a mortal and a god. It is very personal. It's something that I think resonates with my own relationship with my gods, but also probably with other people's relationships with their gods too. Because I think when we look back in history, we see these relationships on a blanket level. And by that I mean on a general level, like outside of, like from a bird's eye view, I guess, of almost like you were watching like a church from above and you could see all the people piling in, and all you see is just this wave of devotion, as opposed to the individual personalized devotions that each person had. Those specific connections there. Once again, another tangent, but yeah, so I think Sappho is a perfect example of like why that's not true. Women can be just as heavenly in love as any man can, and with anyone. I think any relationship can achieve that level, especially nowadays, now that women have so much more power and so much more, so many more rights. Yeah, so anyway, sorry, this video is getting very, very long, but at some point Sophocles well, okay, so Agathon is another character that comes into play. And essentially each character, whenever they step up to do their eulogy, they talk about the good parts of the previous person's eulogy, but then talk about the things that they didn't say. And so Agathon realized that no one was talking about how great love was. And so he goes on to a eulogy about how beautiful love is, how graceful love is, how young he is. He's of the belief that God is actually the youngest God, and eternally youthful. And it's a very beautiful speech that he makes. It was moving, but Sophocles comes in and he ruins it all. And I'm gonna look up in here real quick because he answers some or asks some very interesting questions of him. So like I said, Agathon goes on to a whole spiel about how beautiful love is, how young he is, all these wonderful qualities of love, and how he's the softest god. And Socrates comes in and, like I said, he ruins it. So he asks Agathon if he can ask him a few questions. Let me see. So he asks, first of all, is love of nothing or something? And of course, Agathon responds with of something, because you love someone, you love an object such as art or a book or things like that. Then he says, does love desire what it is love of or not? And there's these questions in here that the way that they're worded, it seems very confusing, but it's actually a simple question. It's confusing because of the simplicity. So he asks, does love desire what it is love of or not? So Agathon responds with yes. And Socrates says, when he desires and loves, does he have in his possession what he desires and loves or not? And Agathon says he doesn't, or at least probably not. Socrates continues and says, surely it's not just probable but necessary that desire is directed at something you need, and that if you don't need something, you don't desire it. Agathon agrees, and Sophocles continues on this idea by saying, now would anyone who was tall want to be tall, or anyone who was strong want to be strong? Agathon says it's impossible. Sophocles says, let's see. He says, if you think about it, Agathon, these people must necessarily have each of the qualities they have at any one time, whether they want to or not, and so this can't be what they desire. So if someone says, I'm healthy and want to be healthy, or I'm rich and want to be rich, or I desire the things that I've got, we should say to him, my friend, you already have wealth or health or strength. What someone is doing in these cases is loving something that isn't available to him and which he doesn't have, namely the continued present and the future of the things he has now. So this, in every other case of desire, is desire for what isn't available and actually there. So he goes into this argument, as you can see, of basically love is the complete opposite of everything Agatha called him, because the only way to love something or to desire something is to do so in a way that is in regards to something that you don't actually have. So in theory, that means that love is actually the complete opposite of everything that Agathon said he was, and Agathon said that he was beautiful, graceful, intelligent, soft, all these great qualities. But in order to desire something, Sophocles is saying that you need to desire things that you don't actually personally possess. And so if love desires all those same qualities that Agathon said that he possessed himself, then that can't be true. Love must not possess those qualities, since he is actually chasing after those qualities, if that makes sense. So essentially this means that love is not beautiful, love is not graceful, love is not all these great things, because he is chasing after them with the people that he falls in love with, or the things that he falls in love with. And it goes into this really interesting discussion about, does that mean that love is a god? Because if you're saying that, if you would agree, like Agathon agrees in the story, that all gods are beautiful and great, and then you say that love is not, because love is desirable of those qualities, then is love really a god? Would you really be so audacious as to say that love is not beautiful, love is not intelligent, love is not graceful? And Sophocles ends up talking about this high priestess named Diotima, and he actually gets his ideas from her, with a discussion from her. She's an oracle, and she talks about how she essentially explains to him what I just explained to you guys, which is that love is the absence of those things, and so is trying to attain those things. And because of this, love appears to be more as a beggar person, born from, resource and poverty. So love is without things, and it's also resourceful. It chases after the things that it doesn't have, and is resourceful about the ways to get those things. It's sneaky, it's beggarly, all these different things. But Sophocles is still really conflicted about calling a god unbeautiful or ugly, ungraceful, all these different more negative qualities. And Diotima talks to him about this and says, well, would you say that love is a god? And Sophocles says that, well, if he's not any of these things, then he can't possibly be a god, because all gods are beautiful and powerful and blah, blah, blah. But then he says, well, then what is he? And Diotima tells him that love is actually a spirit, or a demos, which I think probably most of you have heard of before. But it's a really interesting concept in Greek mythology. You guys should look it up. Demos. It's really interesting. But essentially, love is a spirit and a messenger between mortals and gods. It works between them. And this is a really interesting concept to me. And something that I'm going to have to play on, because I'm not totally certain if I know what that means for my practice. But let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to say. Oh, this is a really important part, and a part that really resonated with me. The rest of it didn't really resonate with me, but I got to this point, and it just really hit home, I think. So Diotima talks about reproduction. She talks about it in a way that kind of ties to what she talked about with love being beggarly, with love being in poverty, constantly searching for beautiful things. And she ties it into reproduction, both metaphorical reproduction and real reproduction, talking about, for example, pregnant animals, and about how if they're in an environment that isn't beautiful, that isn't safe, that isn't conducive to living a healthy life, they will actually withhold their baby and look for a safer spot, a more beautiful spot. And so we do the same things as humans, also in regards to actually giving birth, but also in regards to the metaphorical giving of birth, such as finally writing that novel, or finally making that painting. She says, men who are pregnant in body are drawn... Oh, wait. Okay. So I think this paragraph basically explains this better than I could. So she says, men who are pregnant in body are drawn more towards woman. They express their love in trying to obtain for themselves immortality and remembrance, and what they take to be happiness forever by producing children. But men who are pregnant in mind, there are some who are even more pregnant in their minds than in their bodies, and are pregnant with what is suitable for a mind to bear and bring to birth. So what is suitable? Wisdom and other kinds of virtue. These are brought to birth by all the poets and by those craftsmen who are said to be innovative. Much the most important and finest type of wisdom, she said, is that connected with the organization of cities and households, which is called moderation and justice. Take also the case of someone who's been pregnant in mind with these virtues from a young age. When he's still without a partner and reaches adulthood, he feels a desire to give birth and reproduce. He too, I think, goes around looking for beauty in which to reproduce. He will never do so in ugliness, because he's pregnant. He's attracted to beautiful bodies rather than ugly ones. And if he's also lucky enough to find a mind that is beautiful, noble, naturally gifted, he is strongly drawn to this combination. With someone like this, he immediately finds he has the resources to talk about virtue and about what a good man should be like and should do, and tries to educate him. So once again, this concept of the heavenly love and the common love comes up, and it creates a direct comparison between physical reproduction, such as giving birth, and like mental reproduction, such as writing a story or creating beautiful ideas. And the difference between those two, one being a more humble variety, one being essentially connected to the earth and connected to the body, which men have always kind of strayed away from because of its connection to women, which I think men are inherently afraid of, or who men are inherently afraid of because of the mystery involved with giving birth. Well, I forgot how I began my sentence. But the comparison between that and the more mental variety of reproduction, the one that's connected to air, the one that's connected to wisdom, to swords, which of course men partake in. So really this whole book is kind of like I said, a huge stroke for the ego of all men who want to consider everything that they do as important as what women do, which is, reproducing children. But I think that they're both equally important. The difference is that women can partake in both of those forms of reproduction. They can give birth to children, but they can also give birth to stories, paintings, can give birth to historical situations. And so I think men are a little bit afraid of that. And they want to put women into that role, that very constraining role of being solely the childbirthers of society, and then denigrate that position. So that way their position can seem higher, which is their sole position as, the people who write things and create action in the world. If women can do both the physical reproduction and the mental reproduction, then men are at a disadvantage, or so they think, because they can only do one of those forms of reproduction, which is the mental. But it's kind of it's a very, it's not the right way of looking at things, because I don't really like to see people as being woman first and then human beings, or as being men first and then human beings. I like to see people as being human beings first and then men, or human beings first and then woman, because I think, first things first, the biggest difference between us and other animals is that we are human beings. So I think that is the most important difference, the one that needs to be noticed first. And I think it's the fact that we are human beings that is the most important, because of everything that pertains to what being a human being is, which is having a higher form of intelligence, of being able to create tools, of being able to create beautiful things, of being able to change the world in such a drastic way. Those are the most important qualities of any human being. The masculine and the feminine are simply secondary. And I think masculine and feminine energies and qualities, anyone, regardless of whether they are man or woman, can hold on to those qualities anyway. And you do need both a man or a woman to be able to create a child in the first place. As we get more and more into science, this becomes less true. But I don't necessarily think that makes men redundant, especially since now we're seeing science kind of divulge into figuring out ways that same-sex couples can have children that are part of both of their DNAs. The idea of family, I think, is changing now, and I think it's broadening in a lot of ways. I see it more as community rather than family now. I don't know if my ideas are fully formed on that, but there's definitely a difference here between how families are now and how they were in the 50s, or during ancient Greece. the time of ancient Greece, which is really, really exciting. I think that as science progresses and as the family changes and as our ideas of what love means changes, it's becoming less. Our society, I think, is becoming less segmented, because those binaries are being broken down, and yeah, I don't know. There's a picture in my head, and I can't quite explain it. So hopefully, you guys are kind of getting what I'm saying. But I mean, that's pretty much it. I don't know if I explained it perfectly well. There's a lot of huge ideas in this book. I suggest reading it because it does get you thinking about a lot of crazy things. Some of which I agreed with, but I think a lot of it is kind of tinged by that masculine fear that the ancient Greek philosophers had of women, of their place in society, of their mortality. And I'm trying to move away from all of that. So there's interesting ideas that I think I might keep, such as the concept of there being two different forms of love, though certainly I'm going to change in my mind and in my path what those two forms of love actually consist of. And also this idea of love as being a demos, as being a spirit, a messenger between humans and gods. So as my ideas on those start to form, maybe I'll make more videos about them in the future, but for now I think I just have to sit on it and think about it some more. But yeah, this is a very long video. I'm sorry for how long it is, and I hope it wasn't too rabbit hole-y and confusing. But thank you guys for listening to me, and I do hope you guys have a really, really great day. I gotta go work on some intro to media homework, so I'll catch up with you guys later. Bye.